The ability to skip any of the phases of your opponent is quite rare in Yu-Gi-Oh! So rare in fact that the few cards that can do it are kinda bad. But in this list we're going to go over some of the best cards that can skip your opponent's phases, or at least attempt to. And at number 10 we have Ptolemaeus. This is a generic rank 4 monster which has the effect where you can detach 7 of its Xyz materials in order to skip your opponent's next turn, and is only one of 4 cards that can skip your opponent's entire turn, of which we'll be going over 2 others on this list later on. But I can tell you the 4th card, the 6 Shinobi, will definitely not be on this list because it's way too hard to use. And Ptolemaeus also kind of falls into the category of 6 Shinobi because this card was almost never used for its ability to skip your opponent's turn, and instead for its other effects, where basically you could use this card in order to rank it up into any rank 5 Xyz monster that wasn't a number monster by detaching 3 materials from itself. So during the days of Pepe, they would bring this card out with 3 materials in order to go into Cyber Dragon Infinity, or go into Tellarknight Constellar Diamond to have negates of dark monsters. And because Tellarknight Ptolemaeus gave decks the availability of going into 2 really good negates, it was eventually banned in order to remove generic negates from the level 4 engine. And definitely not because it could sometimes skip your opponent's turn, because it did also have a 3rd effect where during each end phase you could attach a Stellar Knight card from your extra deck to this card as a material, so eventually you could get 7 materials on this card to skip your opponent's turn, but it was more useful to just go into Cyber Dragon Infinity with 3 materials instead, or go into Tellarknight Constellar Diamond with 2 materials. And at number 9 we have Break the Destiny. This is a rather new card as it came out in 2021, which has the effect where you can destroy a level 8 or higher Destiny Hero monster you control in order to skip your opponent's next main phase 1. And also, you can banish this card from your graveyard in order to add a Destiny Hero Spell or Trap card from your deck to your hand. However, you can only use one of its effects per turn. Seeing as there are 2 Destiny Hero level 8 or higher monsters that can bring themselves out of the graveyard after being destroyed, it's obvious that the intended synergy this card had was a way to protect your cards if they would be removed from the field in some other way that's not beneficial to them going to the graveyard. And the fact that it gets to skip your opponent's next main phase 1 is not really supposed to be that much of a benefit of the card, even if it is technically a beneficial effect. If your opponent can't do their main phase 1, that means they can't set up their combos before the battle phase, which does slow down your opponent quite significantly. The ability of skipping your opponent's main phase 1 is technically a strong effect, it's just not that big of a deal, when you could just use other card effects that allow you to gain some kind of advantage instead. And Break the Destiny does also have a graveyard effect to go +1, so you at least go neutral if you decide to use the card effect. But skipping your opponent's main phase is not really the main point of the card, and it's more of an added benefit on top of other things it can do, which is why it's only at number 9, even though this card is probably better than most of the cards I'm going to talk about on this list. Same with Tellarknight Ptolemaeus. And at number 8, we have Neko Main King. This is a level 1 monster which has the effect that during your opponent's turn, when this card is sent from your possession to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, it becomes the end phase of this turn. Which means if this card is sent from your hand or deck to the graveyard by opponent's card effect, that will also proc the effect. So there's no need to actually get this card on the field. So if you're playing against a mill deck, you could actually side in a Neko Main King in order to randomly stop your opponent's turn as soon as it's milled by your opponent. Although mill decks aren't really viable, so there's no need to do that because there's also better cards that can be used for that situation as well. However, one thing to note about this card is that it ends the turn immediately after it's sent to the graveyard, which does mean if it's sent during a chain, that a turn can enter the end phase before the rest of the chain resolves, which causes a couple of really nightmares that are thankfully not really that big a deal because nobody plays this card. Now, there are actually ways to force your opponent to destroy this card during your opponent's turn, if you give them a card like Queen Angel of Roses or King Tiger Wangu, which can even be comboed further if you use something like number 29 Mannequin Can on your side of the field, when you give your opponent a King Tiger Wangu in order to special summon Neko Main from your deck, and then immediately trigger its effect to get destroyed during your opponent's turn right there. So there are ways in order to use this to skip your opponent's turn, but they're all pretty convoluted and not super consistent, and also not necessary if you have the resources in order to accomplish these things in the first place. And there have been some cards that can skip phases that have seen some play, which is why they'll be at higher spots than this one, which can technically be used to end your opponent's turn with some convoluted combos. And at number 7, we have Flashbang. This is a trap card that can only be activated after you've taken damage from a direct attack by your opponent, in which case it ends the turn. So basically, Flashbang is a card which allows you to end your opponent's battle phase and their main phase too, so it could be counted as a main phase 2 skipper. Of which there are a couple of other cards like this in the game, but none of them are very useful and won't appear on this list. However, Flashbang also immediately ends the battle phase, which automatically makes it a lot more useful because it's basically a negate attack, just after you've already been attacked at least once. Although, since there are a ton of cards that can end the battle phase for much less costs, and without requiring you to take any damage, There's no reason to play Flashbang over something like Threatening Roar or Waboku. But when it comes to cards that can skip phases, it's at least easy to use and useful, which is more than can be said about a lot of the other cards which technically have effects to skip phases. And at number 6, we have Thunder of Ruler. This is a trap card that can only be activated during your opponent's standby phase, where it has the effect that says there is no battle phase this turn, which is an old card text way of saying that it skips your opponent's battle phase. And just like Flashbang, this is a very easy card to use that's actually useful, which is why this card actually saw some competitive play in stall decks, as a card that was played alongside stuff like Threatening Roar or Waboku, has additional ways of skipping your opponent's battle phase so they couldn't attack. However, another interesting thing about Thunder of Ruler is it allows it to be used in a combo to basically skip your opponent's turn. See, if you use an effect that skips your opponent's main phase 1, like maybe you successfully resolve the effect of Time Eater, which skips your opponent's next main phase 1 if it destroys a monster by battle, then you activate Thunder of Ruler during your opponent's standby phase, it will immediately skip to the end of their turn, without giving them a chance to go into the main phase 2. And this is because your opponent can't enter the main phase 2 without entering the battle phase first. So locking your opponent out of even being able to go into the battle phase means they can't go into the main phase 2, which makes cards that skip your opponent's main phase 2 not as powerful as just skipping your opponent's battle phase with Thunder of Ruler. However, the ability to skip your opponent's phases is incredibly rare, and of all the stall cards that can stop your opponent from attacking, Thunder of Ruler isn't even as good as some of the other alternative options. So this little ruling of phase changes is often just not known, but it is a niche interaction that can be used in fun gimmick decks, but isn't really super competitive. But even if you're not trying to skip your opponent's turn, being able to skip your opponent's battle phase is also just a useful effect. And at number 5, we have Summon Breaker. This is a field spell card where, during the main phase 1, if a player successfully conducts their third summon of a monster this turn, it then immediately becomes the end phase. This card is the field spell card version of the Floodgate Summon Limit, which is a continuous trap card that makes it so neither player can summon more than 2 times per turn. And Summon Limit is a floodgate that actually sees competitive play, because most decks actually need to summon at least 3 times to perform one of their combos. And because Summon Breaker basically punishes your opponent for going into that third summon anyway, it does seem like a way to just add an additional floodgate if you want to play 6 copies of Summon Limit. But sometimes that third summon of a card can be used during your opponent's turn anyway, like a Zeus. So it's actually better to stop them from going to that third summon in the first place, although that didn't stop Summon Breaker from seeing some competitive play anyway, just nowhere near as much competitive play as Summon Limit. And since Summon Breaker is a card that can skip phases, which is technically useful and actually saw some play, it deserves to be on this list, even if it's probably not as crazy with the skipping like the next 4 cards. And at number 4, we have Mischief of the Time Goddess. This is a quick play spell card that can only be activated at the end of your battle phase and only as a Chain Link 1, and only if all the monsters you control are Valkyrie monsters, where you immediately skip to the start of the battle phase of your next turn. So basically, this card skips your opponent's entire turn, and is one of only 4 cards that's able to do so. And the point of this card is to skip a whole bunch of phases, so it really fits into the theme of this list very nicely. And it also causes a whole bunch of ruling nightmares because of all of the phases it skips. Basically, the intended benefit of this card is to be able to attack again with your Valkyrie monsters, and also avoid the negative drawbacks of a lot of the Valkyrie cards, which sends them to the graveyard during the end phase. Since if you skip the end phase of that turn, those negative effects no longer applied because they just skip the window of opportunity to perform that negative drawback. And being able to attack with all of your monsters again is a really good effect. That's why they don't really have cards that let you perform your battle phase twice outside of this card, or Weather Report. And basically, because Weather Report allows you to perform your battle phase twice, and is one of only 2 cards that can do so, all future printings of cards which mention being able to attack multiple times in the battle phase have to specify that it works in each battle phase, since technically there are cards that give you 2 of them. Mischief of the Time Goddess technically gives you 2 of them as well, but only because it skips you to the start of your next one, rather than giving you a second one during the same turn. And even though this card does skip your opponent's entire turn, it doesn't really have any negative connotations for your opponent, since it doesn't give you an extra draw phase or an extra main phase 1. But it does reset the once per turns on all of your Valkyrie monsters of the field, which doesn't matter very much. However, it does reset the once per turn effects on your opponent's cards too. So if they had something like Zodiac Trident on their side of the field, they'd be able to use the effect again. And I guess it technically does give you another normal summon during your main phase too. Now, Mischief of the Time Goddess hasn't really seen any competitive play, but the fact that it's able to skip an entire turn and then give you a second battle phase is pretty on point with what this whole list is about, and can allow you to have a whole bunch of really fun interactions with skipping turns, and is one of only 4 cards in the game that can skip your opponent's turn at all, which is why it's somewhat higher in this list, over some cards that did technically see some competitive play in the past. And at number 3, we have Arcana Force 21, The World. This is a level 8 monster that has a gamble effect when it's summoned, where you have to toss a coin and its effect becomes one of its 2 effects based on the result. Where if you get tails, your opponent gets to add the top card of the graveyard to their hand during their draw phase, which is a pretty bad negative effect. However, if you get heads, during the end phase, you can send 2 of the cards you control to the graveyard to skip your opponent's next turn. Now, there is a way to force a heads result on this card with some of the Arcana Force support. And since all you need to do is just get this monster on the field, which doesn't have any restrictions on how it can be summoned other than the 2 tributes for its normal summon, and just have 2 monsters to send to the graveyard, there are actually ways to reliably pull off this effect, which has even been done in a competitive environment once or twice. So when it comes to competitive cards that have actually been used to skip your opponent's turn, Arcana Force 21 The World is the only one that was used specifically for its effect to skip your opponent's turn. Even if Ptolemaeus probably had been used to skip your opponent's turn maybe once or twice. It wasn't really the main point of the card, unlike the World. And in fact, the World does have such a decent enough effect that if they ever print future Arcana Force support that's a little bit too strong, there is a legitimate worry that Arcana Force 21 The World might become too easy to use and become an actual meta threat, since skipping your opponent's turn is one of the best effects you can have in the game. And at number 2, we have a more factor Pain the Imagination Dracoverlord. This is a level 8 ritual monster which has the effect that after this card is ritual summoned, your opponent skips their next main phase 1. And also while it's on the field, it negates the effects of all fusion, synchro, and Xyz monsters. And also if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, it has a floating effect in order to add a Dracoverlord monster from your deck to your hand. So, while it's on the field, it has a decent enough floodgate effect against extra deck monsters except for link monsters, and has a pretty tacked on effect of being able to skip your opponent's next main phase 1. Although, out of all of the cards that can allow you to skip your opponent's next main phase 1, a more factor Pain is probably the easiest one to reliably pull off. You see, there's lots of combos in the game that can get multiple copies of Herald of Arclight sent directly to the graveyard without using any other ritual support, which means combo decks can get away with only playing Pain in one of its ritual spell cards, and reliably bring this card out during their first turn. So if you then just combo this card with Thunder of Ruler, you can skip your opponent's next turn, only giving them a draw phase and an end phase, and of course their standby phase to activate Thunder of Ruler. Although, one of the main benefits of entirely skipping your opponent's turn is not even giving them that draw phase. So the combo is not as good as using Arcana Force 21 The World, especially since you need something like Thunder of Ruler in order to skip their whole turn, since they can just go into their main phase 2 otherwise. But because the card actually has a decent floodgate while it's on the field, and then just floats if it's sent to the graveyard, there aren't really other cards on this list that can skip phases that could actually be included in meta decks and realistically come out on the field and contribute to their win condition, whereas all the other ones are just gimmicks at best, where a more factor Pain could actually help contribute to a win, which it has done in the past and has seen a very minor amount of competitive play. And at number 1, we have Yata-Garasu, the poster boy for why they stopped printing cards that can skip your opponent's phases too easily. This is a level 2 spirit monster with only 200 attack that has the effect where if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, they skip their next draw phase. The card also has a restriction where it cannot be special summoned at all, and returns to your hand during the end phase of the turn that its normal summoner flip face up. So you have to dedicate your normal summon to this card every turn if you want to keep skipping your opponent's draw phase, and then you have to find a way for this really weak monster to actually inflict battle damage to your opponent. And the reason this card is banned, as well as Time Seal, which does the same thing but with more restrictions, is because skipping your opponent's draw phase is the ultimate win more effect, where if you're in an advantageous game state, and you're able to pull off the effect of skipping your opponent's draw phase, your opponent can't possibly come back from that disadvantaged game state, unless they're able to draw a card. And just creates a scenario where you've basically lost without actually losing the duel yet. And if this is done too reliably, then it's considered a big problem. There's also another card called Fenrir, which can skip your opponent's next draw phase if it destroys a monster by battle, and is not banned. However, your opponent will eventually run out of monsters to destroy by battle, so they'll get a draw phase unless you're able to feed your opponent's monsters for it to destroy, which requires resources on your part and is not as easy to pull off as just attacking every turn with Yata-Garasu. And there's also a newly printed card called Yaoi, which allows you to skip your opponent's next draw phase when it's summoned, but restricts you to the ability of only being able to special summon once during the turn you activate the effect, and it has a once per duel restriction on top of that. So there are cards that do allow you to skip your opponent's draw phase that are not banned. They're just heavily limited when compared to Yata-Garasu, which is able to do it every turn pretty easily as long as your opponent has a clear field and you have your normal summon available. So, they are fine with the effect existing, just not with it being super easy to use like with Yata-Garasu, which can be kind of a similar vein in stuff like Pot of Greed. They are fine with the effect of drawing 2 cards to exist, but not without a whole bunch of costs and restrictions associated to it, as shown with all of its retrains. And Yata-Garasu was even part of one of the first Tier 0 decks in the game's history, which is why it easily takes number 1 spot on this list. It was actually used for its ability to skip phases, and is currently banned because of its ability to skip phases too easily. Hello, future TheDuelLogs here. Turns out as I was about to upload this video, the new ban list dropped, and it's going to release both Yata-Garasu and Time Seal. This doesn't really change anything I said in the video though, but I thought I should mention that they're no longer banned. And these videos usually take about a week to make, so it's too late to go back and change. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other really good cards that skip phases that we may have missed? Or do you have ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, I'd love to hear about those things down in the comments.